There she is. So we started out with some photographs, and if you're going to do a painting or a drawing, a frontal photograph is fine. If you're going to do a sculpture, that's just kind of the bare minimum starting place. And I'll start this off with a story I had. One of the most distant pieces I ever got as a commission was in Peru. And I got a phone call from somebody who was speaking really broken English, and they wanted to know if I was the guy that did the sculpture of Ken Kesey, and I said yes. They found it on the internet, and they wanted to know if I could do a sculpture of a man named Don Julio Barreda. I didn't know anything about him. I'd never heard of him. So I jumped on the internet, looked him up. Sure enough, there's a guy named Don Julio Barreda. He was an alpaca farmer in Peru before they were allowed to be shipped out of Peru, and he had this huge alpaca farm way up in the middle of nowhere in the Andes. And when Peru changed the law so that alpacas could be shipped out, all of a sudden there were all kinds of people very interested in this man's alpacas. He had a herd of like 500 or something like that. And he didn't know much about the outside world, but he was pretty shrewd, and he had a daughter who had moved into the city, who had access to computers, and when he was contacted, people were asking, hey, I'll buy a alpaca, I'll give you $100 for that. And, just, let me check in on this, I'll decide, and, talk to his daughter, and she got on the internet and found out that they were worth about $30,000 a piece.
Whoa!
And so he became very wealthy very late in his life, and he lived in a very remote place, and he lived among people who were having lots of health problems with things like there were no dentists, there were no doctors. People were dying of things like intestinal parasites and toothaches, and so he decided to use his lately occurred fortune to build a hospital and recruit doctors and recruit dentists, and so he did. And so he became sort of this hero. Well, anyway, so I'm talking to these people in Peru who spoke broken English, and I speak absolutely no Spanish. I watched some Speedy Gonzales cartoons when I was a kid, so few words. And I said, well, send me a photograph, and I'll see what I can do. There were photographs, and they sent me one frontal photograph of this guy in sort of a gaucho hat. And I said, in order to do a sculpture, I have to have more than one view. And so they sent me a second photograph that was maybe here. And finally, they connected me to, after a whole bunch of back and forth in broken English, one of his daughters, because I think he had 5 daughters, and she spoke fairly good English, and she was able to give me several photographs of different angles at different times of his life, and I was able to do that, but it was impossible to do it from here or here. I told him I could do a painting, but sculpture was out of the question. Well, with Francis O'Brien, we started with some frontal photographs. Ones from the side that were a little too far away. I didn't get a lot of information. You can see here that you can't really tell if this bump is from her hair hanging down, or if that really is her cheekbone, or what. You can also see some asymmetry in her face, in her nose. We all sort of develop more of that as we get older. And I needed more shots, and I needed her to get different angles. Like, I'm 78, and if you took a picture of me looking up, shot it down, my face would look a lot different if I was looking down, shooting up, just because of gravity. It catches up with all of us. So I started with just blocking out an armature, packing clay on the armature, then start refining it a little bit. Then we wound up getting some from the Charles Corral documentary that was done. What I was able to do with that is stop action and get different angles of her face, looking up, looking down, looking sideways. I just would watch it and I would slow it down, and when I would get to that point I would stop it and I would take a screenshot, print that out, and then paste it up on the wall, and I could work with that and I could start trying to get dimensions. Now, when I'm working with a model, like if somebody comes to me and say, would you do a bust of my wife? I would say, sure, and that's easy because you know what? I can use calipers, so I can get those little things and I can say, how wide is her face? That's how wide it's going to be. How long is her face? That's how long. And that's a piece of cake. I can knock those things out in 15 hours. And casting takes a little bit longer. But with photographs, you have to sort of make some reasonable guesses and go from there. So when I got her to a place where I thought it was kind of looking down on her, then I start building a mold. And so what I'm going to do here in this talk, I should have said this at the beginning, is I'm going to take you through the process and I'm going to let you see the bronze casting, what I do, and then I'm going to give you sort of this little survey of some of the sculptures that I've done around Oregon. And so what you see here is this little clay dike, and I'm going to build a piece mold. That's several pieces of mold that will eventually fit together like a three-dimensional jigsaw puzzle. So I do that, and I put plaster on it. Now if you go to a commercial foundry, they're not going to do this. They're going to put rubber mold on it. And they're going to put a rubber mold, and then they're going to put a plaster mold over the top of that to hold the rubber, because rubber is, rubbery. Hold that in place. Well, the advantage of doing a rubber mold is you can do an addition of 50. And that's why all commercial foundries use rubber molds just as, that's their starting point. Rubber mold, bring something in, rubber mold, plaster mold. Rodin didn't use rubber molds. He used plaster molds, just like I do. And I figured, you know what? We don't need 100. We need one. And so plaster was fine, and you can get an addition of 5 or 6 out of plaster. So we just use one, and we save ourselves about $1,000 by doing that. So here we are, another section. Now what I do here is after I get these on, and I take the clay off here, and I put a separator on there so I can get these sections apart. So I put you can use soap, you can use Vaseline, sometimes you can use a clay slip. You take this off, do the same thing here, and I'll put another fence here, and I'll put plaster here. So what we get is this. And then we get this. And then once we get it all covered in plaster, then I take little wooden chisels and I tap it with wood and break them all apart like this. And then I wash those out clean, put them back together like this. And then I pour wax, molten wax. I thought I bought a piece of that. It's probably in the coat pocket. Oh, here it is. So this is a wax called microcrystalline wax. It's not, you can't use any wax. You have to use microcrystalline wax or beeswax. They're not the same thing. I prefer beeswax, it's more expensive. And, get it out of here. It's too warm. Anyway, this is what the wax is. You can see it's kind of pliable like clay. And it burns out clean, meaning it won't leave any sort of residue that can't be burned out. Because what happens is, if you have something that's that can combust at 2,000 degrees, you're pouring the bronze in. If it hits that, whatever it is left in the mold that's combustible, it produces a gas that fuses into the bronze, and the bronze comes out looking like real porous lava. And it's not a good look for something like this. It's just holes in the face. So anyway, this is what microcrystalline wax is. It's incredibly expensive. When I first started doing this 50 years ago or so, I hate to admit that, but it was like, $10 for a slab of it. Now it's like, I think I paid $200 the last time I bought a little box of it.
And the wax is what keeps the bronze from sticking to the clay?
No, this is what I'm starting to explain here is a process called lost wax casting. I don't know if you've ever heard of lost wax casting, bronze casting, lost wax casting. I'm going to explain how that works. So I take the mold, you fill it up with wax all the way. So if you can imagine this upside down, I let that wax cool a little bit, and then I pour out the molten core of it. So we're building up 1/4 inch thick of wax. And then this is pulling the mold apart and getting the positive wax here. Let's see. This is a different person. This is one I did for somebody in Washington, D.C. But it's a face. So that's what a face looks like inside out. You can just pass that around if you want. What's interesting, if I hold this up here, there's a certain point where you look at it and it'll pop positive. And once it does that to your mind, it's hard to see it as a negative. So, so now this is where it gets a little confusing. So we built up a mold around the clay, and then we clean it up, pull that mold. This is the mold that we took over the clay. We've got a wax, and we're going to build a separate mold around the wax. And this mold is it's part plaster of Paris and part silica sand. It's about 1/3 silica sand. We mix sand with it so it'll withstand the heat and pressure of the bronze when the bronze is poured in there. It has to be a plaster that'll withstand, well, the burnout, when we burn it out, it's 1,000 degrees, and then the bronze is 2,100 degrees when we pour that in. So we cover the entire outside of the piece with plaster, and we're going to pour plaster inside of this. This is called a pouring cup here. That's where the bronze is going to get poured in. The bronze is going to run down these little tubes, and it's going to fill up the place where this wax used to be. So the wax is going to get melted out. It's going to leave a space, and then we're going to pour bronze into that space. Then we're going to cut all this stuff off, toss it aside, dig the plaster out of the inside, knock the plaster off the outside, and we're going to get something like this. Now, it gets a little confusing. Here's a little more plaster on the thing. This is our pouring cup here, getting plaster around it. We're going to keep building that up.
And inside of the plaster is filled with, inside of the wax is filled with plaster also.
Inside is filled with plaster, outside is filled with plaster. Now, the interesting thing about this, when I was a kid, I used to, you'd see sculptures in parks. I used to think those were solid. Every bronze statue you see anywhere in the United States is hollow, 1/4 of an inch thick. So the one of the thinker, an airhead, Inside is just there. So
That is used.
here we have the plaster built up about 2 inches around the head. We have chicken wire to make sure, just to reinforce that. It's like rebar, reinforcing. And then I'm going to put another inch of plaster over this chicken wire.
Can I go back one step? So inside here is just a 1/4 inch of the wax?
The wax is a 1/4 inch thick.
Okay.
So the bronze on this is a 1/4 inch.
Okay.
And this weighs, I think, 35 pounds. So if it was solid, and there's a reason you can't pour them solid. There's a shrinkage problem because when the bronze cools, it gets first of all, it crusts around the surface, so the surface gets hard, and then the inside starts shrinking. And since the surface is hot and brittle, what happens is that pressure of the shrinkage is going to create a hole, and that hole is going to suck in, and it's going to be somewhere in this. And we don't know where. It could be on the back of the head, where you could maybe cut out a plate, weld it on, and come out with something. But it could be the eyes and nose just completely disappear. So they're all hollow. And what's interesting to me is that problem was solved in China and in Greece and in Benin, Africa, thousands of years ago. It was a problem that those cultures managed to solve in slightly different ways, but the principle of using a core pin, which is a way of putting a bridge between the outside of the mold and the inside of the mold. They put something through the wax that would hold that space exactly as it needed to be, so when they poured the bronze in, it wouldn't collapse or break the mold or separate. And you have everything from pieces of metal to, in Benin, in Nigeria, they were using these giant porcupine quills that would stick through the wax. Managed to connect the inside to the outside. They would hold up long enough for the bronze to cool. It's a really kind of fascinating problem. Anyway, after I get the mold built, I put it in a kiln. And I've got the pouring cup on the bottom because I'm going to melt that wax out. And I heat this kiln here that I'm loading this thing in. It's got a lid to it, and you can't see it in the picture, but it does. It gets all closed up. The door gets closed. The kiln gets heated up to 1,000 degrees. 1,000 degrees, all that wax melts, runs out of the tube at the bottom. It keeps getting hotter and hotter till 1,000 degrees. It burns all the carbon out of the mold, so the mold comes out clean. And then, we get to the exciting part. We melt some bricks. We call them ingots, but they look like bricks. We put them in a crucible. Crucible is a silicon carbide bowl container that
Bricks of bronze.
yeah.
Okay, got it.
And that crucible has to, they go up to like 3,000 degrees. It's basically the same principle as they use on the little tiles to protect the space shuttles from temperature re-entry. They're really interesting. So anyway, this is just after we've turned off the blast furnace. This is called a blast furnace. It's different than a kiln. It goes up really hot, really fast, so I can get this little puppy up to 2,100 degrees in about 45 minutes. And here we are lifting it off. I like that shot. It's kind of dramatic. Now this is the pour we did just before we did Francis O'Brien. In fact, I think this was part of the Lewis Southworth piece, which I'll show a little bit later. Here we are lifting the crucible out. And here we are pouring it.
Yikes. Looks dangerous.
That's what it looks like.
So those are the different components of the Southworth.
Yeah, this is part of the Southwest project.
It's done in pieces and then you attach them.
Yeah, and we weld them together. So this is the Francis O'Brien piece. Now, when we poured it, we had this. This is the pouring cup. It was kind of convex, and then as it cools, it starts to shrink, and that's where we get this big dent. So it's like a funnel going in, and that's part of that shrinkage problem that you have if you pour something solid. Because the pouring cups are, you know, this big around and about that deep, not solid enough to create some of that shrinkage. So that's why they're a quarter of an inch thick. Otherwise, you have something like that happening. So here she is. We're breaking her out of the mold. And this is some water coming down. The water hits that bronze. The bronze is, a few minutes ago, it was 2,100 degrees. So it's probably, you know, 1,800 when we're hitting that. And then as soon as that water hits that metal, it creates steam. And the steam pops the plaster off. It's everything. Get it cleaned up pretty fast. This is one that I shot at night. That's what it looks like when the bronze is still glowing from being poured. Francis O'Brien would have glowed like that too when we put her out. So this is the rough casting, and most rough castings look pretty much like this before. So these little things here, we call that flashing, and what it is little hairline cracks in the plaster. All plaster does it, ceramic shell does it, and a little bit of bronze runs into those. And then we take, in the old days we used to use files, now we have Dremel tools. And you just take a Dremel tool and those things come right off. Sometimes you can just grab them and peel them off, they're that thin. And so this is where the pin was that connected the inside of the mold to the outside of the mold and maintained that space of a quarter of an inch so we could pour the bronze in. And so there's several of these. I think there are 7 in this piece. Here's one, there was one up here someplace. And so we just weld those.
What are those pins made out of?
What's that?
What are the pins made out of?
Different foundries use different materials. I use copper. And I was able to get some real heavy grounding wire off of what used to be a telephone pole. And it was just one that's, you know, the guy had, and they were just going to throw it away. And I said, well, can I have the wire? And they said, yeah. So I got it on wire cutters, brought it home, and I used that. And it works good. It's compatible. Bronze is about 90% copper. And what else? It's copper, it's manganese, a little zinc, a little tiny bit of tin, and about 4% silicon, which is why they call it silicon bronze. So, yeah, so anyway, we weld it shut. In the old days, like Rodin's days, you know how they closed those things? Because they still had core pins in there. And they still had to figure out what to do about it. What they would do is they would drill that hole out smooth, and they would cut threads in it, and then they would put threads on a little bolt of bronze, and they would screw it in really tight, and then they would cut it off, and then they would file it, and then they would tap it with a hammer so that it would close any of that crack. And they would do that for every single one of them. And they're called cold shuts. Today we weld them and just, there we go. And so there, this is the same, you know, there's the hole, there it is after it was welded and ground down. And then I have to texture that with some tools. Here I am using a die grinder is like a Dremel tool on steroids. These things throw metal like crazy. And this is, I mean, if I saw this on the internet, I would say that's AI. The guy didn't really do that. And the reason I would say that is because I'm not wearing a face shield. Because when you really turn these things on, they throw metal all over the place. And you don't want to get hit with it. It's hot. It would probably burn my beard up. But my wife took the shot. She doesn't take the face shield off so we can see her face. So I took the face shield off. So there we go. Here I am using a Dremel tool. I found a little bit of flashing in her mouth, and that's not a good look. So I got the Dremel tool and took it out. I showed this to my dentist and told him he was charging me way too much. So, and here she is after she's sandblasted. And sandblasting removes any of the impurities that might have gotten on her face, any oil from my hands or anything. So we have to put a patina on this, which color. And so here I am putting a patina on, which is just a water and a sulfur mix. And you heat the piece up to about 300 degrees with a little torch, and then you paint the stuff on. It sizzles. The sulfur reacts with the bronze, and it creates the color that you see here. And what it is, it's an oxidation. It's just like a rust of a piece of steel. But what's different than steel is that once the patina hits the bronze, it seals the surface, and so it's permanent. Now, you could get the same thing, the exact same effect with this, if you put it outside and just let it sit there for 50 years. But I'm 78, I thought that was a little optimistic. So I thought I'd just use sulfur and get the patina. Then you highlight it, and the way I highlight it is with a rubber brush on a drill. It spins around and just kind of buffs off some of the patina, and it gives you these highlights. So I'll give you a tour of some of the other things I've done. One of the things I wanted to start with was libraries. So this is the